The first came out in 1942, and it gives us an opportunity just to reflect on a remarkable individual who is associated with much of the history of the Commission, Dr. Edward MacLysaght, who was a gardener, a farmer, an archivist, a genealogist, and much more. Now, early on in the emergency, when he was working as a kind of field officer for the Commission, he went down to Killarney and worked on the old estate office of the Killarney estate that was attached to the Earls of Kenmare, and there still was just about an Earl of Kenmare in the early 1940s. And he spent, I think it's the winter of 41-42, presumably with a candle and paper and pen, trying to make sense of a huge collection of papers that had been, as far as we know, almost unseen by anybody with a historical interest. The Kenmare estate, it's nothing to do with the town of Kenmare, but it's centred on Killarney, but with other bits in Tipperary and West Cork, was enormous in its prime. It was about 120,000 statute acres over 3 counties, and had been accumulated since Elizabethan times by the Brown family, who were very much intermarried into Kerry and Cork families. But of course the great distinguishing thing about the Brown family, apart from the enormous size of the estate, was that they remained Catholic. So here you have the kind of the premier Munster, certainly South Munster Catholic estate that had an element of continuity right down to the time of the Commission, and here were its archives, except they had not been cared for. The recent material to do with particularly the tenants in the towns associated with the family were probably pristine enough, but the older material, which was what MacLysaght was at that point interested in, was in anything but good state. So we have this sort of image, I think this is correct, of MacLysaght working really without any resources, building up a material for what becomes this volume. It's published, in the middle of the war, 1942, and it has its eccentricities, it has notes and comments and abstracts, but full transcripts of some of the material that's there. Now, MacLysaght was sticking to the earlier part of the collection. We know that it must have been several tons of paper that he was sort of confronted, but he chose, and I think chose wisely, to look at the material from the 1600s and the 1700s up to 1795 and the death of the 5th Viscount Kenmare. And within that period, he particularly noted, and I think his kind of historical nose was very sensitive, 2 things which, while they don't take up most of the space of this volume, really stand out in importance. Now, one of them was a series of, I think it's 120 letters written by his aunt in London, Catherine Brown, the estranged wife of the Portuguese ambassador. Generally she would be known as Madame d'Acunha, but Catherine Brown certainly to her nephew, who was coming into the great estate in Kerry. He was inheriting very young, and she, from London, is sort of taking on the role of shaping him, minding him, and doing, if you like, the kind of critical business in London in restoring the estate to the hands of the Catholic Browns, because they had lost the estate during his father's time after the Williamite Wars. And I think the bets were kind of fairly open as to whether it would ever come back to the Browns, even though the next generation were, in a sense, untainted by what had happened in the Jacobite Wars. And it was certainly, if you like, without the lady in London, I think strong possibility that it would never have come back, because the family had known Jacobite links, not as strong as other Catholic families, but nevertheless there was mud there to sling for those who wanted to sling it. So we have then this series of letters which are reproduced in full, I think, in the volume. Now he mentions that he found he found these letters in various places in the office, mostly in an old bag layered in dust. But the problem was there were no dates on them. So one of the things he had to do there was to assemble them in some kind of order. So we have from, I think it's 1714 up to about 1730, these letters assembled, transcribed, prepared for publication. Just to give you a flavour of this aunt in London who has a sense of humour, but she's also politically quite adept at going through the political networking required in London to secure the restoration of the estate and bringing it out of the kind of financial state that it was in the 1720s. It required a private act of Parliament in Westminster to sell off part of the estate in order to sort of refinance it. This is in 1720, early 1727, when she's kind of just telling her young nephew to be careful. Pray consider that you are of your persuasion, Catholic, the richest man and just coming out into the world, and therefore the most liable to be the mark that will be aimed at. You live in a remote part of the country where it's most likely to be insulted, and where you have more reasons than one to think that most of your neighbourhood, though they seem to carry fair to you, would not be sorry to pick a hole in your coat. And then she goes on to say, unfortunately some of the letter is damaged, that, you know, there are kind of Jacobite associations with the family. People will pick out the fact that you have a love of white roses and that you've recommended people to the Pretender and so on. Just be very careful. And even though you may find yourself popular and people will come and take your drink, always be on the ready. Now, unfortunately, this wonderful correspondence sort of ends a few years later, even though both remain alive, but it's the end of an insight into how a great Catholic estate survived at a critical moment. The other thing I want to take from this wonderful volume, though, is from not that nephew's writings, but his son, the fifth Viscount, who is really running the estate from the 1740s up to his death in the 1790s. And here MacLysaght, spots a little green notebook. It's something that was probably a little distinctive among all the dust in the sacks and the bags. And this is the observations of the fifth Viscount that he made, like a kind of journal, going around his huge estate, townland by townland, really noticing how individual tenants got the particular leases that they have, what he thinks of them, and making adjustments. And it's mostly from the late 1750s. So he's a young man. He's a prickly young man. He's very much a kind of patrician figure who, is critical, very critical of the way his tenants, his family's tenants, have been, using the land on the estate. But one of the things that he's rightly famous for is really seeing the potential of the town of Killarney, or the village of Killarney as it was, to become a centre of genteel resort, shall we say. And he says in his notebook about how he has spent a great deal of money trying to bring up Killarney as a town against Tralee, and to give the tenants toll-free use of the town, to give the town tenants cheap or very almost free tenancies for a period, how he has this vision of Killarney being the new capital of Kerry. But he's very disappointed because, in a sense, they've taken the perquisites, but the town is still ragged, and he's very disappointed. And then he says this remark, and it's perhaps one of the things in this volume that historians have picked up and quoted again, because it has a literary quality. I just read it. So why have I wasted my £30,000 on Killarney. It is in a great measure owing to the pride, the drunkenness and the sloth of the middling sort among the Irish here. Every one of them thinks himself too great for any industry, any work, except taking farms, leasing land, reletting it. When they happen to get them, they screw enormous rents for some beggarly dairyman and spend their whole time in the alehouses of the next village. If they have sons, they're all to be priests, physicians, or French officers. If they have daughters, they are bred up to no kind of industry, but to become encumbrances upon their parents and the public, and this sloth and beggary are transmitted from generation to generation. Now, what we don't have is, of course, Kenmare's comments perhaps 20, 30 years later, because in fact, Killarney becomes really quite prosperous over the next generation, and certainly he has a far less jaundiced view in older age of those who were, in a sense, transforming that countryside. Because really, I mean, this book is a sort of foundational source for the study of 18th century Munster. It's a view of certainly a largely resident landlord who has strong ideas, doesn't obviously tolerate fools, but is showing the kind of decisions which led to certainly the growth of reclamation, the transformation of some of the land, particularly the better land on the estate. Now, just a word before we leave the volume, is what happened after 1942? Well, the volume went, I think, out of print in the 1950s or 60s. It was reprinted in 1970. It's again out of print, but it is digitally available through the IMC, I'm very glad to say, and to be used and reused. But the collection, well, after the last of the line, the Brown line, Mrs. Grosvenor died in the 1970s. The bulk of the collection went over to her nephew in East Anglia. The more recent material went into local hands, into the Muckross House Resource Centre, where it remains to this day and has been conserved. And the material that went to England after a long delay travelled back across the Irish Sea and is in the Public Record Office of Belfast, where it can be viewed and has been calendared. But 2 points. One is that some of the material here in the 1942 volume is gone. It's neither in Muckross House nor in Public Record Office in Belfast. Some of the material has come through, but has decayed. In other words, things have been lost. Frail documents that MacLysaght saw with his candle or torch are less complete now. So this is still critical for some of those collections, particularly Madame d'Acuna's letters, which were very frail even in 1942. So there's quite a story there. And I think it's fair to say that there's a lot more work to be done using this source by historians of Kerry, by historians of 18th century rural Ireland.